Now onto my favorite jig, and that's the taper jig. Not only because of its simplicity, it does great tapers, but it also does four-sided tapers, which can be a little bit tough with your standard tapering jig. We'll talk about that in a second. Generally, when you use one of these taper jigs, they all work about the same. You slide the fence up to the blade so that the jig just fits between the fence and the blade. Anything clamped to the outside of that, when it's cut off, provides that taper. Now let's talk a little bit about the construction here. This is relatively straightforward. The bottom is a piece of 3/4 inch multi-ply plywood. The top is a 1/4 inch hardboard. To put the T-slots in there, all we'll do is put a 5/8 dado blade, set 3/16 of an inch above the table, and cut dados in that plywood board in the spaces specified. Once we've cut all of those, we're going to glue this piece of 1/4 inch hardboard to the top of it. Once that's glued, switch your 5/8 dado blade to a 1/4 inch dado blade, and now provide centered cuts over the top. Now that gives you the T-slots. You either use toilet bowl bolts or regular hex head bolts, 1/4 through those slots, and that's what holds these hold downs in place. Now a couple little tips when you're doing this. When you glue this piece of hardboard to the top of the plywood, make sure you clamp it to a known flat surface. By doing that, you assure a nice flat glue up when you're done. If you don't have clamps long enough to bridge this, I suggest making a series of cauls. These can be placed across the top edge here. They have a slight little arch on the bottom of them. And when you clamp down, you'll put a little bit more pressure over the entire glue up. The second thing is, while the glue up is happening, my suggestion is cut some small thin strips and slide them in and out of those slots. That way you'll clear any of the glue up that may be dripping on the inside. Makes it a whole lot easier later to be able to put those bolts in there. Once you've done that, it's now time to make these little stop blocks. You'll notice in here that they're also 3/4 inch plywood, and they have a small 1/4 inch groove down the bottom that rides in the dadoed slot that you put in. Great way to hold something together. Now one of the things I found when I put these together, the bolt that's going through there is 1/4. The piece that's in here, the small little shim that's in here, is also 1/4 inch. And when using the drill press and drilling a hole through there, you have a real good chance of blowing the sides of that out. So what I did is I created a small little female block. So I cut a 1/4 inch dado in there. When that goes through the center, it holds that piece in line so that when the drill bit goes through there, it won't get a chance to blow out that small piece of 1/4 inch shim that's in the bottom. Actually works really well. These then ride in the slots. Each of them rides on that 1/4 bolt and provides some great hold down power throughout the length of this jig. Now it may be a little bit easier as we talk about this jig to actually show you a taper. So what I'm going to do is show you a 4-sided leg taper. When you think about it, cutting 2 sides of a leg is real easy. So you're cutting one edge and flipping the jig and cutting a second one. But when you cut a 4-sided taper, the 3rd cut and the 4th cut result in the taper being next to the hold downs, and there's nothing to grip it to. Sometimes you have to use a shim to hold it. The beauty of this jig is at this end, we have a small little pivot block. And this pivot block has a 1/4 bolt coming out of it. That will help index the end of that leg. I'll show you how this works. It couldn't be easier. I made up a small leg here, which I'd like to consider as a little table leg. What we've got at the top is a 4-inch shoulder. I'd like this to be the part that's not tapered. And it's going to taper down the length of each one of these sides about a 1/4 inch. So to do that, I've marked the edges on each edge about a 1/4 inch in. You'll also notice that I put a hole in the center of this by doing cross lines and then drilling a 1/4 inch hole. It's this hole that's going to index into this small little screw at the end of our pivot block. Now the pivot block is going to adjust up or down or in or out so that what you'll get out of that is this little line laid out exactly on the 1/4 inch mark. These then are held in place at the top edge by our clamps like this. So as I run this past the table saw blade, this is the part that is not going to be cut, and slowly but surely it'll taper down to that cut. And because it's indexing against this little hole at this end, what I'm going to do is pull it off, flip it, and put it in again. And even after I start working into the tapers, it's still going to be indexed off this same edge. There's one more thing I want to add. When you look at a table leg, you want to make sure that the tapers on all of these are always ending up on the same 4 sides. So to do that, Each one of these blocks is adjusted so that it always indexes in the same spot. But what makes it really nice on this jig is this small little 1/4-inch nut. It's a little nylon nut. Once I've adjusted this block right up against the edge of the shoulder, so I know it's always going to be in the same place, all I do is take a wrench and tighten down that nut. So even after I've loosened the clamp, this stop is not going to move. It allows me each time to be able to slide that piece in and taper it. I'll get a perfect line across the top, and I'll get a beautiful taper down the side. Here's how it's done. Now what you'll notice here is that as we flip this leg, the second and the third and the fourth time, a taper began to show up against the bottom edge. And because of this pivot block, we wouldn't have had any other way to clamp that, but the pivot block holds it in that same position. So on each side, that taper is maintained. If you look on the inside edge of this, you'll notice that in this particular spot, the clamp itself in the back side here is only holding it down, but the little stop block has already lost its function because the taper is moving away. The top block, because of that little lock washer, that little lock nut on the top, is holding it up against that shoulder so that every cut is exactly the same. This is a great way to do a 4-sided taper and a great jig to do it on. And one more thing. If you're doing a table with 4 legs, you have 16 setups to make if you were trying to do it with a standard taper jig. With this, once the pivot block and the stop block is set at the top, all 16 of those go very quickly. Now, can I give you one more tip? In most cases, the joinery between the top of this leg and the table is going to be through some kind of a mortise or maybe even a biscuit. Do yourself a favor and put that mortise in or put the biscuit slots in before you do the taper. Otherwise, you really won't enjoy the experience at the drill press or on your mortising table. Now, I told you this was a versatile jig. Here's another thing it can do. I found a piece of pretty wild edge stock here in the shop, and I thought what I'd do is show you how this will also operate as a jointer. What I'm going to do is clamp this board, as you see, just so that a little bit of this edge of the board hangs over the outside edge. I've slid my clamps up, I've removed that pivot block in the front, and moved these clamps to a more appropriate spot. I clamp this down. I'm still going to adjust the fence to the table saw blade like we did before. When I run the jig through there, it's going to create a perfect jointed edge on that board by using a taper jig. Here's how you do it. And now here is our jointed edge. Beautiful, flat, straight jointed edge on a taper jig. What a great jig. All in all, you probably won't find a nicer jig. I guess that's why it's my favorite.